So in part 1, we began questioning Dany's backstory by reading and picking apart a page out of the first Daenerys chapter in A Game of Thrones that focused on events surrounding her birth. And we found a number of serious problems. Namely, the story claims Viserys left King's Landing at night, yet Jaime remembers it being in the morning. The story claims Daenerys' mother's impregnation happened right before her flight, yet her mother was proven very infertile, making the pregnancy appear contrived. The story claims that Daenerys was born during a massive and legendary storm, but the storm would be in the wrong season, and no one else remembers this supposed storm. The storm claims damage to Dragonstone, blocks of stone being ripped out, but the nature of Dragonstone's fused stone goes against this detail, and no one else describes any damage to Dragonstone. The story claims a destroyed fleet and a surrendering garrison, but Stannis and Davos' description of the events involve a battle. The story claims Viserys and Dany sailed away from Dragonstone, though the story also claims that all the ships were destroyed. And the story mentions 4 loyal men that somehow disappear, though a parallel tale with Edric Storm makes it clear that our author has not forgotten about these 4 loyal men. Now, these events all happened when Dany was either supposedly in her mother's womb or a newborn child, so the blame of inaccuracies is squarely on Viserys' shoulders. His stories are clearly not to be trusted. But of course, we already knew that Viserys' stories couldn't be trusted. After all, in Dany's preamble, we hear about the usurper's dogs, Stark and Lannister, a take on the 2 houses that we know is inaccurate. It's simply the level of inaccuracy that's in question, and from what we've seen, it seems the level is pretty darn high. However, as we move on with the passage on the Page of Lies, we find that it's not just Viserys who's a bad source. Dany herself is an unreliable narrator, and we see serious problems with what she remembers. She remembered Ser Willem dimly, a great grey bear of a man, half blind, roaring and bellowing orders from his sickbed. The servants had lived in terror of him, but he had always been kind to Dany. So we are next introduced to Ser Willem Darry, Dany and Viserys' knightly protector. He is described as a great grey bear of a man, though also sickly. Now, being called grey, one would think that Ser Willem is old. And in fact, Daenerys does call him an old bear in A Clash of Kings. So Willem Darry is apparently old and grey. And this is rather odd, as in A Storm of Swords, Barristan tells us who Willem Darry was. He was the Master-at-Arms at the Red Keep, a physically demanding job that requires training others in fighting. Now, regarding this, we should ask ourselves, what's the oldest a king would tolerate a person in this physically demanding position? Honestly, 40? Maybe 45? Yes, Kingsguard end up being old as the position is for life, but there's no reason not to cycle out an aging Master-at-Arms for a younger one. And that's the thing, Ser Willem Darry, who was appointed to his position in 270, shouldn't be that old in 283 when the flight happened, or in 288 when Dany is likely remembering him. In fact, in the world of Ice and Fire, we are specifically told that Aerys preferred to appoint men of his generation, and Aerys was only 26 when he appointed Ser Willem to Master-at-Arms, and 39 at the time of the flight. Not to mention, when Willem Darry was appointed to his position, it was to spite Tywin by choosing Ser Willem over Tygett Lannister, who is even a few years younger than Aerys. Generally, to spite people, you choose a contemporary rival. Everything points to Ser Willem Darry being in his early to mid-40s, and at most 50, when Dany has her dim memories of him as a girl of 4 or 5. That is, Willem Darry was appointed to his position when he was in his mid-20s, like the king, and would be in his early to mid-40s 18 years later. As a point of reference, this would make him around the same age as, say, Oberyn Martell, Mace Tyrell, or Jorah Mormont, who, yes, may have bits of grey hair, but would never be described as old and grey. It's characters like Jeor Mormont in his late 60s who are called old and grey, and Jeor Mormont is specifically described as struggling with physical activity. Or simply put, it's exceedingly unlikely that just 5 years before being seen as old and grey, a person would be tolerated as a Master-at-Arms. Now, it's also striking that Willem, a great bear of a man, is also sickly, 2 facts that seem at odds. Wouldn't being sickly and bedridden work against maintaining muscle mass? And in fact, in A Clash of Kings, Dany elaborates on Ser Willem's illness and says that he died of a wasting sickness. A wasting sickness, by the way, as the name suggests, causes humans to waste away. They are illnesses that prevent the body from maintaining muscle and fat tissue. And so it's not just a contradiction of being large and sickly, it's a contradiction of being large and wasting away. It doesn't make sense. Ser Willem should either be a great bear of a man who's dying of a disease that has no effect on muscle mass, or he should be a thin, emaciated man dying of a wasting sickness. He can't be both. And this is not just Dany simply remembering a great bear of a man before his sickness. Her memories are clearly of him when he has experienced advanced degeneration. She specifically says later that Willem never left his bed. And it's not that our author doesn't understand how sickness would make a large man smaller. Catelyn makes this observation about her father in A Game of Thrones. Hoster Tully had always been a big man, tall and broad in his youth, portly as he grew older. Now he seemed shrunken. The muscle and meat melted off his bones. And so we have two large men who have become bedridden with sickness. Hoster Tully has shrunk, as one would, but somehow, impossibly, Dany remembers Ser Willem remaining large while wasting away. Another thing that doesn't make sense about Ser Willem and his role as Master-at-Arms has to do with the education of Viserys. One would think that as a Master-at-Arms, a man whose vocation is the training of people in swordplay, he would see value in the training of Viserys. Even after Ser Willem's supposed sickness, one would think he would assign others to the job. As Dany said, he certainly wasn't shy about barking orders at people. Keep in mind, Viserys supposedly lives with Willem Darry from age 8 to 13, and in A Feast for Crows, Loras tells us that boys of 8 act as squires and begin their training. He convinces Cersei it's time to start training Tommen, the king. And yet when we see Viserys, he doesn't even own a sword. Dany tells us that he's never used one in earnest, and when he does wield a sword, one lent to him by Illyrio to make him look kingly, he waves it wildly around his head like he's unpracticed with it. If Illyrio thought a sword made Viserys fit the role of a king, and Loras and Cersei thought a king should know how to use a sword, shouldn't Willem Darry, an actual Master-at-Arms who literally trained Viserys' brother, also feel Viserys should be trained to use a sword? Why would Willem Darry shirk the one job he was actually an expert at? He called her Little Princess, and sometimes My Lady, and his hands were soft as old leather. Next we find that Willem Darry has two nicknames for Dany, Little Princess and My Lady. Now it should be noted that the former nickname is fine, but the second nickname is actually incorrect. In A Song of Ice and Fire, one should not address a prince as lord or a princess as lady unless one is saying something like my lord husband or my lady liege. The proper address for a prince and princess is my prince and my princess, respectively. In fact, it's Maester Cresson who lets us know this in the prologue of A Clash of Kings. The princess would see the white raven. Ever correct, Pylos called her princess now, as her lord father was a king. King of a smoking rock in the Great Salt Sea, yet a king nonetheless. So Stannis controls little, but he is still a king, and the same is true of Viserys. He too is a king, and is thus called Your Grace, and thus his sister and heir would be a princess and should be addressed as My Princess. Now, I don't want to harp on this for too long, as, to be fair, the characters in story do make mistakes. Cresson himself calls Shireen My Lady, Arya once refers to Myrcella as My Lady, and Arianna gets called My Lady by Darkstar, who should definitely know better. And even Dany herself gets called My Lady a whole bunch of times by Jorah, who should also absolutely know better. So although our author has established a rule, people in story seem to break the rule all of the time. Nonetheless, it's still noteworthy that we have two nicknames, one correct and one incorrect. Of greater concern with this particular sentence is the fact that Ser Willem Darry has hands as soft as old leather, something that a Master-at-Arms would never have. Now it should be noted that George R.R. Martin frequently writes about characters' hands and feet. It's a common part of his writing style, whether they be calloused or pristine. The hands and feet tell a story of repeated action, physical pain eventually leading to toughness, or the inverse. A lack of physical pain leading to softness, For example, we hear about Dany, Arya, and Sam all growing calluses in their journeys. The calluses help illustrate the transition of our characters. And frequently, we hear about the calloused hands of fighters. Whether it be Brienne, Osney Kettleblack, King Robert, Alysanne Mormont, Lem Lemoncloak, Thoros of Myr, Khal Drogo, the Hound, or Obara Sand, the calluses tell a story. And it can't be stressed enough how deliberate our author is with his descriptions of hands and feet. He thinks about this stuff. On a side note, back in 1976, George R.R. Martin wrote a story called A Beast for Norn, starring a character named Haviland Tuff. And in that story, he describes Tuff's hands as calloused. After writing several sequels to the story, our author changed his opinion on who Tuff was as a character, Tuff becoming more of an intellectual and less of a physical mechanic. And so, in 1986, when our author released a compilation of the Tuff stories called Tuff Voyaging, he revised A Beast for Norn, and in the revision, the calluses were removed. As I said, he thinks about this stuff, and so it's of significant note that Willem Darry was a fighter. He was a master at arms for 13 years, and then he was a knightly protector for a king. He absolutely, positively shouldn't have soft hands. He should have calloused hands, like our fighter characters do. And no, it's not that Ser Willem lost his calluses from a lack of use, as Robert still had his calluses. At minimum, Willem Darry would have unremarkable hands, but instead he has soft hands. Soft hands that are so remarkable that Dany mentions them twice, and are one of just a few characteristics actually given to Darry. Meanwhile, soft hands are found on the following characters: Grand Maester Pycelle, Tyene Sand, Maester Balabar, Cersei, Maester Cerwyn, Varys, Maester Theomore, Lyness Hightower, Clytus. You can see the pattern. It's not characters known for physical fighting. Instead, it's mostly maesters and gender-conforming women. And yet somehow, a former master-at-arms is in this company. He never left his bed, though, and the smell of sickness clung to him day and night. A hot, moist, sickly sweet odor. And so next we find that Willem Darry was not just sick, but so sick that he never left his bed, which is a perplexing thing to say about Darry, as later, in A Clash of Kings, Dany actually sees a vision of Willem Darry when she's at the House of the Undying. No sooner had she thought of it, than old Ser Willem came into the room, leaning heavily on his stick. And so we appear to have a contradiction. In Dany's memories, Ser Willem never left his bed, but now he's able to walk. Now, one may point out that this version of Ser Willem is a hallucination, or perhaps the manifestation of magic, and shouldn't hold too much weight. And sure, we should certainly note the weirdness of the House of the Undying, but there is one notable word in the latter passage that reinforces the idea that a contradiction exists in Dany's mind. And that word is his. At the House of the Undying, Willem Darry is not walking around on a stick, he's walking around on his stick. As in, Dany remembers a particular walking stick, one owned and used by Willem Darry. And so it does seem that Dany remembers Ser Willem walking, which is in complete contradiction to her memory of him never leaving his bed. Now, the latter part of the sentence about smelling a hot, moist, sickly sweet odor is also a bit strange, as one cannot smell temperature. That said, the inside of the nostrils can feel temperature, and there are some objects that smell differently when hot versus when cold. For example, coffee. So perhaps the passage is referring to one of those phenomena. But Dany's smelling or feeling heat day and night is a problem. Braavos is a city, by all accounts, that is cold and rainy. And keep in mind, when Dany is having her supposed memories of Ser Willem, the year is likely 288, 4 years after her supposed birth in 284. People's first memories are usually in their 4th year, and 288 is almost certainly not a summer year. We are specifically told by Tyrion and Maester Aemon in A Game of Thrones, which takes place in the year 298, that summer has lasted 9 years. This means the year 288 was likely spring or winter. Essentially, the weather in Braavos surrounding Dany and a dying Willem Darry should be similar to the weather in Braavos surrounding Samwell and a dying Aemon. Dany's memories of Braavos should be cold, not hot. Now, one could perhaps argue that a fireplace is keeping the environment warm around Ser Willem, though a fireplace would also likely dry the air, making it not moist. Not to mention, a fireplace would make the room smell like burning wood, smoke, and ash instead of a sickly sweet odor. That was when they lived in Braavos, in the big house with the red door. Dany had her own room there, with a lemon tree outside her window. And here we are, Braavos and Lemongate. Now, we will get into Lemongate again, but related to this, people often ask me about the first version of Dany's story, Blood of the Dragon, which was published a month before A Game of Thrones back in 1996. And in that version, the house with the red door was not in Braavos, but in Tyrosh. And some would argue that that somehow explains or excuses the lemon tree. The logic is a little fuzzy. Regardless, we will unpack Braavos, the lemon tree, and Blood of the Dragon in detail in part 3. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.